40 years, our next guest has been a staple in your film collections. From Indiana Jones to Star Wars and every major blockbuster in between.
If you ran a Fortune 500 company and lost 50% of your customer base, while your primary product became a punchline in every corner of the internet, you wouldn't get a legacy exit interview. You'd get a pink slip and a security escort. Yet, as Kathleen Kennedy walks out the doors of Lucasfilm in 2026, the media isn't asking how she broke Star Wars. They're helping her blame you for not liking the pieces. We've spent a decade being told that the Force is female, but the only thing that actually changed was the Force becoming financially fragile. Today, we are dissecting the Kennedy Era, a 14-year case study in corporate gaslighting. We're going to explore how Kathleen Kennedy didn't just mismanage a franchise. She fundamentally misunderstood the mythic nature of Star Wars, treating it as a niche political vehicle rather than a universal epic. In the process, she liquidated decades of brand equity to chase an audience that never showed up, all while branding the loyal fans who did show up as the villains of her narrative. This isn't just another angry fan rant. We're going past the surface level critiques to look at the hard data, the internal studio contradictions, and the actual rhetoric used in her final deadline interview to show how the culture war was used as a strategic smokescreen for a decade of executive incompetence.
The Kathleen Kennedy era of Star Wars is important, not because it was good, but because it's a masterclass in how gaslighting can keep even the most incompetent of people in power. The story of Kathleen Kennedy is the story of a billion-dollar bait and switch. It started in 2012 with the acquisition of Star Wars by Disney and the promise of the Star Wars Forever era. But Kathleen Kennedy's tenure wasn't just a period of creative struggle. It was a decades-long exercise in brand liquidation and audience gaslighting. The thing is, the Kathleen Kennedy era of Star Wars became this weird paradox where the media was constantly trying to remind everyone she was technically the most successful female producer in film history, even as they had to explain away her many, many failures as she presided over the most expensive decline of a bulletproof IP. I think when you look at Kathleen Kennedy's time with Star Wars, what you actually see is just this timeline of chaos. And I think you need to break this down into sections. And it all started with the 2015 to 2017 era, which I kind of think of as just the legacy burn. It was the afterglow of what Star Wars had always been. Kathleen Kennedy and J.J. Abrams come out with The Force Awakens, which, though it was touted as this next step, it was really just a soft reboot. It was a very safe play.
Yes, which was able to, I feel like, ensnare fans because they were like, okay, maybe we're going in a different direction. Maybe they'll build on this next time.
It was enough of what you loved from before to bring over the old fans and enough glimmers of maybe where it could go to have hope for the future. The Force Awakens really was a masterclass in how to bait fans. Not only do you have a whole film which promises Luke without him actually being in it, but there were other things like Rey's lineage, which led to a lot of fan discussion and hope that maybe there was going to be a meaningful resolution to that.
And a big reveal.
Which obviously there was, but also wasn't, which takes us into The Last Jedi, which was the hard pivot into subverting expectations. And almost it felt like a rejection of the interest that they had tried to cultivate from the fans in the last film.
Yeah, and I feel like it was kind of a pivotal moment where the fandom kind of fractured, where a lot of people were like, yeah, I'm out.
Yeah, if this is where it's going, if it really does mean nothing, I feel foolish for having spent years guessing, right? For theorizing, for investing in this.
My life is a lie!
Which then brings us to our first failure, because in 2018, they decided to release Solo, a Star Wars story. And I feel like that was the pivotal moment when they realized the Star Wars name didn't mean that it was just going to print money anymore, that it wasn't an insured success.
That should have been the red flag, right? That a Star Wars film made so little money, which was supposed to be the origin story for one of the most popular characters, not just in Star Wars, but in film history.
Yeah.
I think from Solo on, you see just how much damage was done with the first two Star Wars films under Kathleen Kennedy. The idea that you're going to run it back and give an origin story for a character that you so unceremoniously killed off, it really does show the audacity that really characterized her tenure at Lucasfilm. The idea that nothing is sacred. And don't even get me started on Dial of Destiny.
I won't do it. Don't speak of it again.
But if Solo was the first failure, I feel like The Rise of Skywalker was when they went into full-on panic.
Yeah, because it was a complete reversal of everything they had set up. And we got the somehow Palpatine returned meme.
Somehow Palpatine returned.
Which I think may end up being the most lasting remnant of the Kathleen Kennedy era Star Wars, was the somehow Palpatine return meme.
Yeah, and the most obvious, creatively bankrupt idea anyone has ever seen in Hollywood.
It showed a rare double reversal. The promise that Rey's family and lineage was going to be meaningful, before in the next film telling us, no, actually it's meaningless, before pivoting to, not only is it meaningful, it's the most meaningful thing in the entire Star Wars franchise.
What are you saying?
The Rise of Skywalker, I think, was a breaking point where many people realized their investment had been wasted, that there was no master plan, that they really were shooting from the hip, film from film, chasing internet trends.
Dude, and that the fans were taken for a ride.
Yeah.
That there was no plan. If any other CEO presided over a 50% drop in theatrical revenue and a graveyard of a dozen canceled projects, they'd have been gone years ago. But at Lucasfilm, failure was rebranded as progress.
So from 2019 to 2023, Disney and Star Wars kind of just retracted and retreated to their streaming platform.
Yeah, I feel like after such a monumental failure, they're like, we need to step back for a moment and focus on something that we can deliver on.
And so you saw things like The Mandalorian, which, was successful and I think gave people a little bit of a return to form. And I think a large part of the success of the first season of The Mandalorian was, for the first time under Disney, Star Wars kind of felt like Star Wars again.
It was a small sense of goodwill. But then as it continued on, it started to lose goodwill after each season. But I feel like with the huge success of The Mandalorian, it gave them the license to continue doing things that they wanted to do, which is where you got projects like The Book of Boba Fett and The Acolyte.
Yeah, things that they probably were going to do no matter what. But after they had been put in their place a little bit with the huge box office decline of The Rise of Skywalker, they thought they had to go back to basics. But it did embolden them to carry on exactly in the direction that they clearly wanted to go. Which brings us to the final act in the Kathleen Kennedy debacle, 2024 to 2026, which was marked with huge budgets, low viewership, and just eventually the handing over of Star Wars to Dave Filoni. Kathleen Kennedy's tenure will be most remembered by a level of incompetence that would be quite funny if it didn't also coincide with the death of the most popular IP in history. What makes this whole thing so tragic is there were so many warning signs that Star Wars was headed in the wrong direction. Things that could have been corrected if it wasn't for the near constant gaslighting from the Axis media.
I feel like it was very obvious that Disney Star Wars did not know what they wanted until they were already filming, because you had the firing of Lord and Miller from the Solo project mid-production, and then the replacement of Colin Trevorrow from Episode 9.
Yeah, there's a clear lack of vision and an even bigger lack of leadership. Under Kathleen Kennedy, they made it sound like not only did they have no plan, but that was somehow an excuse, like there could be no plan. And she famously said that, I guess unlike other things, there were no comic books or 800-page novels for her to draw from as they tried to build out their universe. And she said all this despite decades of the expanded universe being the foundation of the Star Wars fandom.
But I feel like the warning signs were even obvious with the merchandise decline. From 2016 to 2020, Star Wars toy sales saw a significant slump, with retailers often forced to clear out dead inventory of characters like Rose Tico or Admiral Holdo.
And I think the real sign that Star Wars is headed in the wrong direction was in the fact that those characters featured so prominently in The Last Jedi tells you how little Kathleen Kennedy and Disney understood the average Star Wars fan. The sort of arguments that have been made to try and defend Kathleen Kennedy and her legacy are things like, well, she gave us The Mandalorian and Andor, which are both critically acclaimed. But the thing is, the success of things like Andor feel more like happy accidents. It feels like they succeeded in spite of her. It feels like these things were allowed to exist in a corner without Kathleen Kennedy's heavy-handed committee approach.
Well, and it was also cited that she actually had very little involvement with Andor.
And with things like The Mandalorian, it feels like it was made without her involvement. And once she realized it was a success, they spent all that goodwill in season 3 to prop up failing sequel trilogy lore.
And then even the declining box office was challenged by people saying that the franchise made billions of dollars under her, so it couldn't be a failure. But Star Wars is too big to fail in the short term, you guys. The critique isn't that it made $0. It's that the brand equity has been liquidated and you can only sell the first new Star Wars movie in years once.
Yeah, if anything, the subsequent decline in box office proves how much damage she did. That much of the early success was just the afterglow of how loved Star Wars was. And I know a lot of people who only watched the sequel trilogy out of a sense of duty to Star Wars.
And then the continuously present argument that any backlash towards Kathleen Kennedy is just toxic fandom and misogyny, which I find hilarious because this is the primary gaslighting tool, because fans had no problem embracing Jyn Erso and Princess Leia for decades. The issue isn't female leads, it's poorly written characters that are used as a vehicle for contemporary culture war posturing rather than mythic storytelling.
It is the final refuge of the creatively bankrupt to turn it all political and hide behind the culture war and the protectionism that comes with creating something that you can point to a subsection of the culture as being a problem and saying, well, they hate it, therefore you need to love it. But to truly understand the failure of Kathleen Kennedy as the head of Lucasfilm, I don't think you can just look at the failure of the things that were released. You have to talk about the failures that led to things not being released.
Yeah, the canceled projects or the graveyard of ambition.
Kathleen Kennedy's most enduring legacy will be just the list of what could have been, all the projects that were announced that never saw the light of day.
Because one will never forget the Benioff and Weiss trilogy that was supposed to be coming out when they ruined the ending of Game of Thrones because they were super excited about their Star Wars project.
It was the first real signal that Star Wars was going to be aligning itself with people who had failed elsewhere. Rian Johnson was promised a trilogy. We spent 7 years with the is it going to happen? Is it canceled? No, it's delayed. It's still happening. Carousel, which has become all too common in Hollywood. You know, nothing is canceled. It's just forever delayed.
Exactly.
And the few fans who cared enough to inquire were usually put on blast for daring to question what's taking so long.
And it was only confirmed recently that he's not coming back to do it because Kathleen Kennedy said he was spooked.
Patty Jenkins was promised a project.
Well, not even that, they put a ton of money behind a promotional clip that they released to announce the fact that Patty Jenkins was finally going to do her Rogue Squadron film.
Another tool in Kathleen Kennedy's tool chest was the very, very expensive sizzle reels, which is how she got the Acolyte greenlit. You know, spending an enormous amount of money trying to build up hype, inorganic hype, and then essentially just sunken cost fallacying your way into production. Like, we've already spent all this money, we might as well, right? I think the most damning evidence that Star Wars has become completely creatively bankrupt was the announcement that there was a project to bring back Ben Solo, that they were going to yet again give us a somehow Palpatine return moment by bringing back a character that everybody assumed was dead, that had fallen to their deaths, no less.
Yeah, which in commemoration of Kathleen Kennedy finally stepping down, I'm wearing this shirt because it's the only thing left of Star Wars, the shippers.
That does feel like the audience that was most heavily courted by Kathleen Kennedy were
Disney Star Wars, yeah.
Yeah, were the shippers.
And the thing is, all of these projects didn't just fail because of schedules. They failed because there was no central vision, only a series of knee-jerk reactions to Twitter trends and corporate risk aversion.
Looking back at Kathleen Kennedy's time with Star Wars, the real question is just, how did it go on this long? How did it get this bad? Why was she not asked to step down or removed earlier?
Dude, how was she propped up throughout all of this, of the multitude of failures, the announced projects, the things that never happened, and the clear decline in the fan base, and no one did anything?
And I think it's pretty simple. Kathleen Kennedy was protected by some of the most insane corporate protection and media gaslighting ever seen. In fact, it felt like there was more effort put into scripting the narrative of the toxic fan than there was for any actual project under Kathleen Kennedy.
Yes, and that there was more thought put into the headline that was going to explain away their failure rather than into the actual script.
Yeah, because every single project, before it even came out, there were just numerous articles put out explaining why it wasn't going to do well, why there was a really, really mean and awful fan base that was going to try and review bomb it, and that it couldn't be that the shows and movies weren't popular. It was they were fighting the good fight and dealing with an unprecedented attack on their projects.
Yeah, on their actual real fans.
If there's something that can be learned from Kathleen Kennedy in her time in charge of Star Wars, I think it's just the dangers of media protectionism.
Yes, because the media outlets had no problem shielding all of her failures by branding actual fans as the vocal minority or alt-right trolls.
Yeah, anybody who was critical of Star Wars under Kathleen Kennedy had to be a bad faith actor. There was the narrative that none of them had fair criticism.
Yeah, that they couldn't be genuine fans.
Which brings us to the most recent article from Kathleen Kennedy. The 2026 Deadline interview is kind of her exit interview for Star Wars. And in this article, we see the very gaslighting that marked her time with Star Wars. In the article, Kathleen Kennedy asserts that the reason that her projects failed or struggled was because, in reality, Star Wars is filled with a very small but vocal minority of fans who only want to see the same thing over and over. And that should tell you everything about Kathleen Kennedy and what she contributed to Star Wars, because it is the most dishonest take in history, especially coming from someone whose first installment in this universe was almost a complete rehash of A New Hope.
Bravo for them to make Rey a orphan from the desert who discovers inner powers, inherits a robot with important information that leads to the destruction of the Death Star. It's fresh because it's a woman.
While she presided over Star Wars, there was this attempt to rebrand every one of her failures as innovation. It was this like innovation trap where every single example of bad writing was, redefined as challenging the audience, not a failure.
There's a clear pattern of victimhood as well. We saw Kathleen Kennedy, as well as the Access media, use the culture war politics continuously as a smokescreen for the fact that they had plummeting Nielsen ratings and low box office returns.
Anytime there was any pushback against the creative choices made, it was always viewed as an attack. Every single time the fan base spoke up and tried to warn Kathleen Kennedy that this was not the direction that they wanted Star Wars to go, that they would not continue as customers if they went down this path.
Yeah, that they wouldn't continue opening their wallet and supporting this franchise.
Those audience members, the bedrock of Star Wars fans, they were branded as toxic or alt-right trolls or whatever other political hot topic word was needed at the time to just dismiss them as unreasonable. But the thing is, at the end of the day, the media narratives and the gaslighting, none of that matters because we have the numbers and the numbers don't lie. No amount of spin can cover for the fact that under Kathleen Kennedy, Star Wars saw almost a 50% drop from episode 7 to episode 9. And that isn't just a box office number that's not an abstraction. That is representative of the very real audience that they lost, that was there at the beginning of her tenure, that saw her vision and said, no, thank you.
Yeah. You can't say $1 billion is a very, very small group of the fan base.
So not only was there this box office slide, there was also just an incredible amount of just bad judgment.
I like to make men uncomfortable. I enjoy making men uncomfortable.
Kathleen Kennedy overinvested in things that nobody wanted.
Nobody cared about.
Yeah, if you look at the budgets, it doesn't take a genius to figure out that The Acolyte was not going to resonate with a lot of Star Wars fans.
Leslie likes to say that the show is a combination of Frozen and Kill Bill.
And yet, Kathleen Kennedy dedicated $180 million to the budget for that show. And now I know what you're probably thinking. $180 million? I thought it was more. And the reason we say $180 million was that was what was initially being reported in the very news outlets that were gaslighting and trying to mitigate the near constant series of disasters coming out of Lucasfilm under Kathleen Kennedy.
And that also was a pattern that we started to recognize, that no matter what the budget was that was initially announced, every single project under Disney Star Wars actually cost more.
There's very clearly an attempt to make every single failure seem less detrimental and try and promote an idea that Star Wars was in a good place.
That they were winning.
And that Disney was making all this money from Star Wars because it was resonating with fans. Not only was it not making the money that you should expect a Star Wars film to make, it was also costing them so much that it's questionable whether or not they actually saw any profit from these projects at all. Maybe what's most telling about the difference of where Kathleen received Star Wars and where she took it is the state of merchandising. We all know that George Lucas famously had a whole deal where he got a certain amount of the Star Wars merchandising, and that's a large part of where his fortune came from. Star Wars toys used to be synonymous with collector's item success, longevity. They were the type of things that if you found out a relative had secretly had an unboxed Luke Skywalker from the original film, you knew they were rolling in it.
They're rich.
The ability of Star Wars to build a brand that carried so much value over the decades is what made it the biggest IP in the world. Under Kathleen Kennedy, it's all gone. Star Wars toys are near constantly on discount. It's really Baby Grogu or nothing. They've taken Star Wars, this giant galaxy of diverse and interesting characters, and they've rallied around one mascot, the most Disneyfied mascot of all of Star Wars.
Yeah, because it's cute and cuddly.
And it's very emblematic of the direction they wanted to take Star Wars and how different it is from where Star Wars actually exists in the culture. Or the fact that Disney tried to brand their most critical fans as incels. You know, the sort of fans that have spent decades buying Star Wars merchandise, when their entire business model relies on people with high disposable income who can afford to pay $800 for lightsabers and spend $5,000 at their Galactic Starcruiser hotel, which also failed.
For the last decade, people have been asking, who has Kathleen Kennedy been making these Star Wars projects for? And I think we still have no idea. But what we do know is that they were not for Star Wars fans. I feel like it's been very obvious that Kathleen Kennedy and everyone who's been over the Star Wars projects have gone out of their way to alienate the core fan base of Star Wars, because it seems like their strategy was trying to sell Star Wars to people who didn't like Star Wars at the cost of the people who actually care about Star Wars.
Yeah, for some reason, they took Star Wars and they treated it like it was some niche IP, something that needed to be made mainstream like it wasn't already in order for it to have enough attention to be successful, which is absurd. It's the most successful, or at least was the most successful franchise in film history. It was like they thought they needed to do what Marvel did, which is make it more widely known. And all they really managed to do was just strip it of all of its mythic, cinematic prestige and turn it into this content machine for their subscription service. There is an irony to the fact that Star Wars is now retreating back to Dave Filoni, a man who has built his entire image and brand around his love of the lore. And this comes after years of Star Wars under Kathleen Kennedy treating lore like it was some sort of shackle.
But the thing is, Kathleen Kennedy's legacy isn't the movies she's made. It's the bridge she burned between a studio and its most loyal supporters.